Hello, everyone. Can we get your attention, please? Hi. We're gonna get started. Please find a seat and grab some food. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our LIPS presentation. Our speaker today is Tobias Armborst, principal and co-founder of Integral Partners and professor of urban studies at Vassar College. My name is Diana. I'm a PhD student here at Columbia's Urban Planning Program, and I will be moderating the session along with my co-organizers, Benita and Mauricio. I will begin with a few brief logistical announcements before turning to introduce our speaker. We are recording today's lecture, so please remember this if you do not wish to be recorded. After the presentation, we will have time for a Q&A. We'll start the Q&A around 2 to 2:15 p.m. so that we have enough time for everyone's questions. I will be coordinating the Q&A with attention to diversity and inclusion. So if you've already asked a question, please allow others to do so before asking another one. So with that, I am delighted to introduce our speaker today. Tobias Armborst is professor of urban studies at Vassar College, where he teaches courses in urban design and architecture. He is also principal and co-founder of Integral Partners, a Brooklyn-based architecture, planning, and research firm that has won many awards for its innovative projects. Integral's recent projects deal primarily with the public realm and include a neighborhood plan for Newark, New Jersey, a public park and street tree nursery in Lower Manhattan, and a temporary public space and community programming at MoMA PS1 in Queens. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tobias Armborst.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Diana, and thank you all for having me here today. As you can tell, I'm still a little bit of a sniffle, but I hope my voice will carry me through the next 45 minutes or so. So, as following Diana's assignment for today, I would like to show you a little bit of and some new work of Interboro, the office, which I lead together with Georgine Theodore and Daniel Dioka in Brooklyn. And what I would like to do in particular is in and through the work, more broadly address a couple of questions that are important to us and that I think will be, or imagine will be relevant for you as mainly planning urban design students, PhD students here at Columbia. As planning students, you're critically engaging with policy, history, and theory, but at the same time, you also have your feet in material practice, right? You're not students of some abstract science, but you're students of the environment around us, the ideas of and ideologies of people who make and remake that environment, and whose life in turn is shaped by it. And working in a field that incorporates both critical reflection and material practice, I think there are a couple of questions that are important again for us and for you. And one important that is always, or one question that's always important is how do you actually do that, right? How do you work across boundaries of critical reflection and material practice without doing two completely different things, right? How can you be both participant and observer? And in the process also, how can you stay true, right? When you move, say, from independent to academic work or independent, more academically driven work, like where we started years ago, to actual professional work that is funded, has clients, has an agenda that you might or might not agree with. How do you stay true to your ethics in your work? Important question to us as we're really started as a critical practice that was about selecting our own projects, doing advocacy and developing work entirely out of research, research into contemporary conditions, urban conditions, but subsequently have grown a bit and taken on larger work, but still mainly working for public agencies and community organizations. That leads me, and I'm wondering where I can advance. Okay, here. Okay, perfect. All right. Thank you. So that leads me to a third question, again, one that is important for us and I think important to you as planners, urban designers, or students of planning and urban design, namely the question, who are we? What role do we play, right? As urbanists working in specific places, what role do we play within the networks of human and non-human actors, vis-a-vis more or less defined project goals, vis-a-vis official and unofficial clients, stakeholders, publics. I believe that in any design or planning projects, it's important to make an attempt, an earnest attempt to understand the network of actors and the relations of powers, and then to define one's own role and agency vis-a-vis those forces. It's pretty obvious at this point that planning and urban design are political, always political, and that once you enter the realm, you need to understand where you are and which side you're on, which side you want to take as a professional within each specific situation at each specific site. We, and in the office, don't think of ourselves as a force for good with some sort of general recipe, like a model of architecture, social service, but as a critical participant observer who are endlessly interested in learning more about very specific local conditions and about the role we can play in those conditions. So that was sort of, I'm going to show what it was maybe a little bit packed into this introduction here. I want to show you how in some newer and some older projects that plays out, how we maybe have defined our specific role as urbanists vis-a-vis the situations we're working in, the people we're working with, and the people we're working for. I want to Okay. And I want to show you, depending on how we're doing time-wise, I want to show you one or two examples from different set of different buckets of work that we do. So we do planning work, right? We do regional planning, city scale planning, land use planning, and neighborhood planning. And I want to show you one or two examples of more recent work from that sort of group. We make public spaces, often small scale built interventions that are always about setting a stage for public life in some way or another, highly specific responses in each case to specific needs and opportunities. And then there's a third group of projects which we call conversation pieces, for lack of a better term. So those are objects, models, pieces of furniture, board games, newspapers, all sort of designed objects that are about instigating conversation, right? Often in connection with more large scale, more long-term planning projects. Right, as you all know, planning work can be quite abstract, right? Often high level, long term, and therefore also a bit, I don't want to say boring, but boring sounding. And hard to appreciate in its immediate relevance. And so we always look to find ways to design more immediate, short-term ways to tactile objects to act as mediators in a way, as sites for conversation about those more long-term, high-level goals. So, and finally, through the last group, exhibitions and books. So another set of designed artifacts, but less maybe about setting the stage and more about visualizing, articulating, and hopefully sometimes demystifying urban planning and urban topics, really as a way to engage also with non-expert audiences. So maybe in passing to mention the book, The Arsenal of Exclusion and Inclusion, which is maybe part of that group. So I was hoping to show you one or more projects in each group, and as you'll see, hopefully in the process, these projects are based on a kind of let's say optimism. So I'm trying to also bring up the kind of remaining pieces of optimism here as I show you these this work, right? And hopefully get a sense of a little bit of that that hope and that sense of also play that is so important for engagement and a sort of trusting conversation that's at the heart of what we need to do as planners and urban designers, right? But so I want to show you one or two projects here, and I want to start with planning projects. So those are mainly projects from the city of Detroit, where we've been working for a long time, and we really started out when we started office like 20 years ago or so. We started initially really working in Detroit, not so much as planners or urban planners, but as urban fans, really just looking at what was going on, suspending judgment, looking, listening, documenting, interested in the place, and even more interested in what people were doing with the place. This was at a time when Detroit, the narrative about Detroit, the stories that were told about Detroit were largely, dystopian narratives about where people were waxing poetically about the shrinking city, reverting to nature, a wildlife returning to the city. And on the other hand, there were these large visions of an urban renaissance, either in the form of traditional urbanism or in more spectacular flavors. So instead of engaging with those sort of large narratives, we decided to look at the city at the time and look specifically at what people were doing who were living there, people who had stayed in Detroit in spite of the city's shrinkage, and who were curiously absent from these large narratives, right? So there were the stories about wildlife returning to the city. There were these visions of renewal, but there was very little really about what was happening on the ground, what people were doing to the city, and they were doing a lot of really interesting stuff. Transforming properties at the smallest scale, taking advantage of Detroit's shrinkage by doing something that we at the time named blotting, which is the practice of on the part of residents to take, borrow, appropriate vacant land adjacent to their properties and make larger parcels. So it's really a very small scale everyday practice of dealing with one's environment. So here you see in this diagram of a typical Detroit block what happens. So this was the Detroit at the in the mid 20th century. So it's very typical grid, 20 by 100 lots with single family homes. Over time, people left, homes were burned or fell apart. The density of the city decreased. And at a certain point, you see what happens here with the parcelization. people just took on a vacant land and made these new, more eccentric, let's say, properties that kind of changed the land ownership, right? The pattern of land ownership of the city and the genetic code of the city. Something you could see, observe in property records as we did at the time. So if you just look at who owns land, you see a lot of people who well own a lot of adjacent properties, like the families right here, the Misik family that actually over time acquired an entire block, right, and made this really large compound there. And practice that you could also see in addition to property records, you could also see by driving around the city, right? So there were a lot of plots that you could observe just looking at what's going on, right? Pool plots, antenna plots, trampoline plots, a plot for somebody who wants to park perpendicular to their house. Really pragmatic ones, right, for access ramp, and purely aesthetic ones like the symmetrical one here, right? So there's a phenomenon that you can observe again by looking, by observing specific properties over time, right? Like this family that turned the typology of the typical house with the garage in the back over a couple of years, first into something that sort of expands to the side, right, by buying a adjacent property and then ultimately putting a fence around all of the two properties plus a third one that's actually city owned. Actually, I shouldn't say that on the record here. City-owned parcels, so they put a fence around that and turned this into a courtyard house, right? So there's a kind of typological change even in the architecture that's driven, again, by these very, very small moves on the part of homeowners in Detroit as they make these larger plots. So this was a kind of this was really a project, again, we did this a long time ago, and it was about visualizing, right? About making an everyday practice that's not known, that doesn't even name, that people just do. Give a name to that, visualize it, and thereby also advocate for it, right? Advocating for existing transformative practices on the part of Detroit residents as they formed these new patterns of land ownership. And over the following, say, 10 years, these practices indeed became more visible, also to a degree more accepted, right? So city planning policy shifted from fighting these informal appropriations of land towards embracing blotting as an approach to urban redevelopment. And I want to in a minute show you an example of a more recent project where we, maybe brought this more towards policy from this really just making drawings to advocate, right? How do you pragmatically make this operational as a city policy? After really showing up in Detroit and being observers, we changed our role then a little bit over the following years, getting kind of sort of somewhat random city work, right? Prosaic work like a rewrite of the city's signage ordinance, right, which needed an update, which actually sounds sort of a little dry. It sounds a little dry, but is quite an exciting work in a city that is so rich in visual culture as Detroit, right? So just go back one here. Okay. Right. So there's an incredible culture of hand-painted signage covering entire buildings and all things that were illegal under the, at that point, current signage ordinance. And so the question is always, how do you write an ordinance that kind of well, makes those things legal, but also encourages them, right? So we wrote into that ordinance actually incentives and support for this sort of culture. There's a number of practitioners in the city who do this, and there's certain areas where that work is encouraged, right? So can be quite interesting to work on something like a signage ordinance if you have the kind of that sort of stuff to work with. We also did a project on all of the vacant schools in Detroit, city-owned vacant schools, which are in the around 60 of them. And so there's a question of what does he do with them? How do you what situation are they in? How does the community, which is not always the community that's really adjacent to the school, but distributed community, how do they feel about these buildings, right? So all of those questions of historic preservation and of community preservation play a role there. And we just started to work recently on the I-375, which is one of those projects we just talked about, like those, right, that sort of we'll see what happens to them, right, where there's a large highway that was built through the city in the late 50s, early 60s, right, at a time that you probably all know, right, where highway construction really became a tool in the hands of a federal tool with, or a federal weapon with financial and legal tools for local growth coalitions to really make their cities. Here we see the Mayor Cobo and Henry Ford II, plus that third guy who I forgot who that is, but seems to be very important because he has his own oil portrait right behind him there. So they're just remaking the city there, and part of that was I-375, this massive highway that destroyed the Black neighborhoods of Paradise Valley and Black Bottom. And so there's an infrastructure project now, quite complex, driven by DOT, Michigan DOT, to replace this highway with the boulevards, and we're doing the land use and zoning of those massive pieces, that land, all that land that's freed up if you take down a highway and replace it with a street. So we'll see what happens with that. But the project that I wanted to show you is a neighborhood plan, or part of a neighborhood plan that we did for the Campbell Bangletown Davison neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that's really marked by stark discrepancies. Part of this, really a collection of neighborhoods in northern Detroit. Parts of the neighborhood see a lot of reinvestment, a lot of development, mainly driven by a Bangladeshi immigrant community, right? So this is, I think initially there were people, immigrants who migrated from Queens to northern Detroit, and a couple of decades ago. Now, actually, that first generation moved mainly to the suburbs, but they still have sort of a very sort of nostalgic image of this area. But now it's really the place, if you immigrate from Bangladesh, this is really one of the places where you want to be, right? Because it's a whole support infrastructure, all the shops that you need for that. But then the parts of this area that are still also pretty emptied out and marked by a lot of vacant land. And for example, Davison, I don't know if you see how well that reads, but there's a lot of vacant land in this area. But often what at first seems like vacant land is actually very much in use, and that's the case here as well. Even if that's not immediately visible. Sometimes vacant land gets, as we saw, bought or by neighbors, sometimes land banked by people in the community. Sometimes neighbors appropriate through use. Sometimes they just care for it, right? Clearing up trash. And through this kind of light use and reuse, the clear boundaries of property sometimes become blurry, right? Introducing new, sometimes temporary, sometimes seasonal forms of land tenure. And that's something that's really important to understand when you're tasked with coming up with a plan to disperse vacant land, as we were in this case. where there's a lot of in this area there was a lot of land bank owned property, and the question was really who can use this land, and in order to make an informed decision about that or a recommendation, of course, you need to understand some of those light forms of land use that typically are not visible to planners, right? Because they're not really in any database or anything, right? You just don't really know unless you spend a lot of time or talk to a lot of people. But again, like some important information that sort of falls through the cracks of the tools we have to visualize or to recreate or to understand places on our screens or in our offices, right? So in this case, what we propose here is a number of policies. Let me just walk you through this here. So this is part of the neighborhood, the Davis neighborhood. And what you see here is all the land. I don't know if you see the light gray in the background, but what's in green there is all the vacant land that's owned by the land bank. And what we propose here is for the city to first reserve land that the city needs. This is for green infrastructure. What you see, it's not that much, right? But really strategically important. There was an area here that was because of the kind of intricacies of the ways in which the grid in that part of Detroit developed, has very long blocks without any cross streets, and really where the grid served as a barrier to access to this neighborhood. And so we proposed the city kind of reserve part of this land to build new crossings. Actually has just been built, this crossing here. So, but relatively small interventions, right? So this longish green part that you see, that's like a new park, linear park. We also propose there's a whole set of or a subset of parcels of Detroit land bank owned land that should be reserved for blotting. What you just saw before, right, where neighbors take on land, there are these are basically parcels adjacent to houses where people live, right? So people have a stake there who maybe have started already using the land, and so that was the proposal here. And I mean, if I say that, it sounds actually really kind of obviously banal, right? But it was a real thing to say, hey, if you have this land, people who are living there should actually have some sort of first dibs, right? And they should have some stake in this, right? When there was still an idea of a large investment coming in, right? And we need to keep this land for some investor to build some new neighborhood or something like that, right? To just say, no, there's a finer grain, and actually there are already people here and you should just talk to them first. That's again, for us in this room, it seems obvious, but it is still something sometimes to point out. Okay, there's another layer then of parcels that we proposed are reserved for stewardship. So those are parcels that are already actually used, maintained, stewarded by people who might not be neighbors, but who have some sort of stake in land. Again, something that you need to, find out first before you can make a decision about land. And then the last category was the remaining parcels that didn't have anybody's stake yet, or that were not really in anybody's purview. Those we bundled, proposed to bundle, turn into larger parcels, a whole, a spectrum of sizes here, each come with one house. So there was a lot of interest in the more adjacent neighborhood of Banglatown for to use parcels in a way, or to use the land in a way that didn't really fit into the current zoning yet, but for agriculture, for example. This is a group, Bantu Gardens, cooperative of Bengali women who had quite a bit of success selling a very specific kind of bean that is, I guess, a staple in Bangladesh and works really well in the upper Midwest, right? So they grow that in their gardens, and they were expanding, and they were looking at a larger piece of land. So here, one of those bundles, a larger piece of land for agriculture came in handy. Okay, so there you see, like, again, a neighborhood that at first might look like just tabula rasa, right? This green field with a bunch of kind of maybe rundown looking houses, right? If you look really closely, there's already so much going on and so much you can find, and you need to find a way to be really fine tune your proposals, as we did in this set of proposals here for land distribution. Again, this is, well, information you need to get, right? If you want to look at a site and you're charged with making recommendations for the use of that land, you need to kind of understand, who has a stake here, even if people are not the powerful people that you meet in a stakeholder meeting, let's say, right? And that information of like who is actually active, who's stewarding land. In order to get that information, again, it's not something you can find in a database, right? There's no database for land stewardship for somebody picking up garbage, and you also can't really, to a certain degree, can't really find it by just looking around, right? You need to talk to people in obviously community meetings, focus group meetings, but right. So this is like really, asking who's doing what here, who is activating the land. But sometimes you also need more informal settings. Like in our case, we used this ice cream truck that was moving around in the neighborhood and doubled as a site, right? So you see, there's people can get ice cream. In this case, they're getting ice cream for free. And they also give us information on that map there. That's ice cream. You can plan on it. That thing was moving around in a neighborhood where an ice cream truck is a very everyday and very normal piece of infrastructure. And as a way to have conversations about the neighborhood, there you see the plan of the neighborhood, right? To have conversations around a neighborhood with people who have no time and also zero interest in going to a couple of hour community meeting at the local high school gym, right? But who is still, obviously no place better than we do, right? So again, this ice cream truck is what I would already put into the category of those conversation pieces, right? How can you, as a designer, really use design objects that are, helpful in setting a conversation so that you can talk about more long-term goals, right? And go beyond the kind of, well, often so unimaginative and boring kind of engagement, right? That we're using, right? Which is just about, Post-its and things like that. Anyway, so let me just show you one more thing before we move on from that neighborhood, Mr. Moten. So this is one of the people that we met in those conversations, right? So this is a farmer, and you see there an axonometric of his farm, again located in what was a residential neighborhood and is still zoned as a residential neighborhood. So there's two blocks, right, with all these like parcels. Again, very standardized way in which Detroit developed in this very kind of let's say uniform way with those residential parcels, single family homes. You see here a lot of those homes again are gone, and what you see in green is Mr. Moten's farm, right? So there's a field here, like where he also grows some kind of bean. It looks a little messy. You don't really understand immediately that it's like a crop, but it is. There's also a little house that has that's kind of big in the backyard. And then there's this fenced-in area that has a lot of animals, right? There's also what used to be a corner store and butchers as a local halal butcher thing in the basement there. Again, this should be off the record because it's totally legal, right? It's in a residential neighborhood. And so at least at this point, it was still illegal and invisible, right? It's an invisible farm that you don't really know about unless you're one of the people who are in the know and drive up there and then stop and call local first to get the most amazing organic food, right? So great, right? There's a farm, really good food, locally produced, totally illegal, invisible, and I'm showing this to you again as a reminder to planners, look, pay attention to stuff like that, right? Because that is, I mean, Detroit really has one of the cities that has fair share of, planning best practices coming from Copenhagen or, creative cities and stuff like that, right? That is creative cities, right? Somebody's really making do with sort of these little things that are left over, turns us into a farm, produces good food, right? And we do really well just trying to understand that sort of thing before we propose anything, right? And then to see how can we be helpful? Where can we be useful in, well, for example, making this legal, right? Or thinking about ways in which practices like that can be supported. All right. I showed you the ice cream truck as an example of a conversation piece, right? Artifacts that set up spaces conversation, and that's something we spend a lot of time with in the office, right? It's a little older, design tables. This was for Cambridge, right? A table that was moving around in the U-Haul van to, again, have something that's maybe a little bit interesting looking, to have a conversation about things like zoning, which is not the thing that you would necessarily have a conversation about on the sidewalk with strangers, but that is really important and kind of sort of interesting and not that hard to understand either, right? Came with a newspaper. We do a lot of newspapers. This is actually something we're working on right now, the strategic land use Dan's world there in St. Louis, strategic land use plan just about to be finished, where a lot of that kind of conversation with basically all of St. Louis, right? Because it's about the strategic land use plan of the entire city is happening in these through these publications, like comic books. We use a lot of comic books. This was an older project. It was also for Detroit. A game, right? The game of zones. I don't know if that reference still works with like this generation. It's been a couple of years, right? So Game of Zones, which actually is a game, and board games are always a really, as you probably already or also practice, right? It's such a helpful tool and useful tool to have conversations about urbanism, right? Because a lot of the things that we're dealing with in cities where somebody's just really lucky to own a certain property and it's a roll of the dice, right? So a lot of the things that are playing out in cities are actually can be simulated in a fun way through games, right? And again, that's a good conversation starter. This was one we did in Antwerp, where there was a large infrastructure project as well for the ring road of Antwerp. I don't know if I don't have any images of that. I was not going to speak about this, but Antwerp is one of those cities where you have a kind of historic center and a very kind of, let's say, a well-to-do bourgeois citizenship, and then a massive ring road, and then suburbs with a lot of new Belgians living just outside of the New Belgians as like immigrants, mainly from North Africa, living just outside of the ring. And so there was a project to cover some of this. Actually, it's been going on since the 1980s. Proposal to cover parts of this ring road and build a park. And a certain percentage, right? And the question is, so it's a very, very complex, obviously, engineering project, but also one where you have to just make certain decisions of which part of this thing should be covered and which are priority and not, right? So questions that really everybody who's living in the city should have an opinion about and should be, whose voice should be heard. And so this was a way to move that kind of discussion that happened very much in town hall meetings with an audience of people that all looked like me, to bring that sort of discussion also to the malls and the shops and the shopping streets in the residential districts just outside of the ring. And again, to have a kind of something that's more playful. Anyway, and then this is another one of those that we did for another. This was really for maybe more for a design project, landscape design project, for a playground. We designed it for a park in St. Louis, which is so it's a large park in St. Louis, and we designed a nature playscape. So one of these playgrounds is entirely made of natural materials. And in order to do so, we made this station that has a lot of games in it and brought it around the city to a lot of community centers and schools. There you see the list of schools. Because, there's a lot of kids, obviously, in St. Louis who would be happy to use this playground. And they're all over the city, not necessarily just adjacent to that park, which is a slightly nicer neighborhood. And so this was a way to generate ideas for the design, but also to build a constituency of people for future users of this project. So people generated a lot of ideas in those meetings. We, as designers, took those ideas and translated them into things that we thought looked sort of fun and could be interesting elements for a playground. So you see there the originals that we were giving and the sketches. And then I think that's important in a kind of co-design process. So we translated into drawings, but then importantly, brought these ideas back to our client, the selected client, or a group of our future users, something that for the benefit of our client, our official client, we called the Youth Advisory Council, which was a bunch of kids who decided to come back and evaluate the ideas, right? And then we prototyped them. Again, this was made out of natural materials, so it was easy to prototype some of that stuff. And in the end, the whole thing is a little sort of funny looking because there are a lot of ideas in there that really came directly out of the sketches, right? So something that you can do in a project maybe like this, where the hope is that some of those kids recognize their original first sketches, right? So you have not so much saying these are the experts and we just do what they want, but to have design process be a kind of conversation, right? Where you go back and forth and generate ideas as we are well, I'm actually an architect by training, right? So I went to architecture school and practice architecture. And those of you who went through that training know or that during an architecture project, you hardly ever work by yourself, right? And you constantly meet with like the HVAC consultant or so. And so there's constantly this back and forth, right? And as architects, we're really trained to develop ideas in that sort of conversation, right? And we have the tools for that. We have the drawings, we have models and all of that stuff to have on the table as we meet with consultants and other people. So I always feel like, in a way, as architects, we have some of those skills, right? But we don't always use them really in a way that to the max, right? In that we widen the conversation perhaps to other people who are not only the consultants, but also say, people who are not typically involved in design processes, right? So there, I think we do well going away from the idea of ourselves as sort of solitary specialists of form making, right? And really activate our skills at co-designing, or I guess would be the term. So how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay, so I was gonna show you a couple of public spaces, but maybe I'm gonna flip through this because it's really really old. This was a project we did many years ago for PS1, which was actually really a beginning of that kind of way for us to think about co-design, right? So there, maybe in a nutshell, that the ask was to design a structure for the courtyard of PS1. You know that PS1 in Queens has its concrete wall courtyard, and for many years, architects were asked or commissioned to design structures for that courtyard for a duration of 3 months. And the way we generated our design in, I guess, 2011 was by really based on conversations with the neighbors of PS1. You see there just across the street. Doesn't exist anymore, this taxi. There's, I guess, big building now, but at the time there was a site for cab drivers to park and repair their cars. And they had this little canopy set up with chairs, which in a way was very similar to the program that we were tasked with designing on the inside of the museum, right? A shade roof, some place to sit, and so on. So the way the kind of short of this design that we developed for the museum was to say, we ask neighbors, like in this case, the cab drivers, if there's anything they need for their little space here that we can design or buy, store in the museum for the summer during the 3-month duration of the installation, and then give to them, their new owners, afterwards. So we talked to about 200 individuals and organizations around Queens, and designed all of these things that were stored in the courtyard, lots of trees that were all here, had little tags that said who owns these, like mirrors that were installed in the courtyard in this sort of pseudo post-minimal, installation, but they were actually commissioned by a local ballet school, and after the summer installation were then passed on to the ballet school. So a kind of really small scale architectural intervention that was part of a much larger process that was then over time distributed throughout Queens. And what was really sort of for me the most exciting part of this was that a lot of those groups, those individuals, organizations that we worked with or worked for, got material out of this were kind of in a form of gift exchange, organizing programs in the courtyard of the museum during the summer. So there's an official program, right? There's an exhibition, there's like a concert series, but then also ballet school that got the Maris did a program of ballet performances. Irish Center did a quilt making workshop, library, a lot of readings. What was that called? It was a graffiti center, also now long gone. Also in Long Island City, they got a lot of stuff out of this, and in exchange organized a airbrush exhibition at PS1, right? So you have this sort of really juxtaposition of different discourses, right? PS1 art and then airbrush art in the courtyard, right? So really, it becomes a public space, but it also was, I think, a way that design, in this case, really mainly furniture design and the design of the space can really become a place of encounter, let's say, right? Again, here, like some optimism, right? How that you're not designing this thing just because it's like a cool thing, but it's part of a process that sets up these moments of encounter between different discourses that are present in the neighborhood. All right, so now I talked about it, even though I was going to skip it. Okay, let me just finish maybe with one public space project. Again, very lightweight intervention. So this was is in the Bronx, the Refreshing Waters. And this was a project we started working for Department of Health on placemaking, and particularly in the South Bronx, which is an area, as you know, that really gets very hot, right? So there is not a lot of green space. It's very paved. So you see on this heat map, it's really a heat island, let's say. And we started working on this, and so cooling stations play a huge role in an area like that, particular in an area where we were working, where there are a lot of senior citizens and a lot of senior citizens without air conditioning. This was at the beginning of the pandemic when, well, as you also know, there are a lot of cooling centers around the city, right? And there was one in the Hunts Point Library, one of the cooling centers that actually closed at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Reduced capacity. And so there was an immediate need to respond to that, let's say, emergency, right? So a placemaking project that's sort of supercharged by the kind of immediate emergency of a cooling center that closed. And so we designed an outdoor cooling center across the street, which is basically that, right? It's a bench, some seating, some massive fans, and misting lines. So you have misting lines along this entire fence, and then these massive fans that really measurably reduce the temperature in the plaza in front of it. So here you see the setup of that. It's in the axonometric. And why I was gonna show this to you is really that's a place where we directly learned from everyday urbanism, right? Where you have the kind of sort of famous way in which everyday urbanists reuse infrastructures such as a fence, right? Whereby a fence that's not made for that purpose. There's a reinterpretation of this piece of infrastructure now as a commercial space, right? Something that we observe and are fascinated by, right? How the meaning of a place, the meaning of a sidewalk, urban fence just temporarily completely changes, turns into something else by somebody putting up clothes there. And so here we kind of learned from that, and we had to, because this was again working on a public space intervention with very little time, right? Responding to an immediate emergency where there's just not enough time to get a permit to do anything in the realm of the street, like one of those floors of the street, put up a inflatable cooling station. So it's really about reusing urban infrastructure such as the ledge, the fence, and turn this into a cooling place that then also kind of I think a successful public space, right? So there's this woman, she waters. She is always in that square, and she named the project. This was actually such a gratifying project. Sometimes you do these things and you just don't know if people like it or not, right? In this case, it's like you go there and people are like, wait, that's good. Thank you, right? So it's one of those immediate effect, both in cooling and in feedback to the designers. Also play and here you see sort of a little bit then also how it takes all these other uses, right, as a backdrop. All right, I was going to talk about some a very recent exhibit, but I think I'm going to stop here since I spoke for a little while so that we can have a conversation. All right. Sort of, I guess the multiple answers. This sort of like a couple of summers. There's always, I mean, there are always these issues, somebody breaks and so on, and then those sort of things that sometimes get in your way when you work like something like this that's like very low budget and really working with the immediate things. We did a couple of those, actually, one across the street, one at the Point, one at the Patterson House, throughout the Bronx. Right? But to really think of it as a network, but mostly also as a prototype, just sort of is a because it's really easy. And again, it's like about appreciating the kind of ways in which, I don't know, a street vendor sets up, right? And really makes a difference in just, but with the most stuff and turning a public space into something. So yeah, I guess that there's three levels to answer your question. One, this was for 3 summers. Next summer, I'm not sure yet what's going to happen. All these questions around that. We did a few follow-up projects that are in walking distance here. So really think of it as a network. And then 3, most importantly, as a prototype or as an invitation to think about those. Well, I don't want to say ad hoc, right? Because again, it requires some planning, right? But maybe practical ways of in the absence of larger planning or investment. Really good. But there's another level to that then. Um, I mean, what's in these neighborhoods like, again, I showed you the one half of the neighborhood, that other side of the street, really very, very active areas. Are these different levels and tenure. Fairly not that much pressure on the land quality, right? So it really allows for stronger emphasis value, right? And all of a sudden, those kind of clear-cut boundaries of ownership. Really has a right to this, right, without owning it. And so the additional level of owners versus renters, that's true, which is obviously such a place in New York City is all deciding as a project proposed. All of a sudden, what you think of as a is like two opposing camps, right, based on who owns what. So yeah, I don't know in a situation where there's less pressure on ownership, but it's really interesting. But again, also you said that in your comment, right? Again, the importance of just really finding I don't really say patience, but the way, the kind of openness to really understanding a little bit of what people are doing, right? And how that can make what the sort of the dignity of that and the truth in that, right? That is sometimes really still disappears in us looking place, right, from the tool and the planning or from any kind of remote perspective through the screen. Um, Signage ordinance, briefly, but this sort of the main problem. Well, in Detroit, there's sort of they're really two. At least at that time, there were two very different ways in which signage played a role. There's a lot of development in the downtown, massive displays and so on, and then there are these kind of in the neighborhoods. A lot of these practitioners just over time have used paint to really make artwork. And, well, some, and I wish I had some of those graphics there, right? Some of it is graphic, really, how you present it, right? It's not like the way I showed you, like kind of funky photographs, but there's a couple of examples, right? Like the hipster sort of cafe that has on there, right? And sort of put that sort of into context. I mean, it's not that hard to really understand for a sensible person that a locally grown form like that is can be again a quality of a place. What we think of authentic. There's a actually whole kind of small niche practice of people doing paintings. Right? That's authentic homegrown practice, right? So that's sort of the arguments we use. But I mean, you're right. Obviously, it's always hard to convince anyone of anything and of anything that's not conventional practice. Right? For that project, actually, we did these we tried to videos like videos that didn't go over very well with the cities. They're like, turn it off, turn it off. You don't want to see it. It's a struggle, right? There's no, I don't know if there's a recipe. I think the graphics, and again, this is one of the things that we have as, let's say, particularly as designers, right, good at saying graphics to make the way that you words. I don't know if that really answers your question. placemaking, Department of Health, right? Places for active play. And then sort of or it took a turn with, and then obviously was the framework that you set up for something else now. Think about it. How do we need like some sort of it's really about like some sort of young Yale type of measuring outcome sort of thing, right? Not sure. For this, it's really, I mean, we did some surveys and asked people, what do you like this? And we got like actually we handed out these little sheets and asked people like it. 100% return, they all like it, right? So obviously it's always a bit of it's a little tricky, right? And I think that our work is you need, especially when you're public, you need to have some way of how you do that. You haven't really beyond the kind of almost, let's say, anecdotal. That was your question. But I mean, in terms of this, I mean, we did all of these things of measuring temperature. Wow, really different. It makes a real difference. Have now, this was the first one, again, a bunch of bronze. I did one actually in Greece, a bunch of other places. Fine-tune this and make it more also easier for people to replicate. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, it's sort of a maybe a continuation. I mean, so we're doing a lot of these, not a lot of these, but regular trying to do regular trying exhibits, which are if like some of the projects I showed you were more about conversation pieces. This is more about again using some of the designed objects, design of exhibitions, design of books. Maybe speak about urbanism, speak about planning in terms that are also interesting to non-specialist audience. So yeah, the book now is sort of in its second edition and outdated, right? The arsenal of exclusion, but we've been doing exhibitions on that topic regularly. This last one that I was going to show you was actually a show we did. So we've been working in this NYCHA property in the Bronx and doing a little design service. Right? So working on the playground, with the residents wanted to build a adult playground, and so we helped them with the design. And we were asked to participate in a show about maintenance and care in Berlin, and for that, it's a long story, but did a lot of research on the history of maintenance and care at NYCHA has now Bronx, and there's a lot of interesting way to the way that NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, presents itself in these photo shoots through the years. 59, NYCHA commission photo shoot of the Patterson houses we're working. And it's all about sort of uniform people maintaining the place, right? And then there's later documents. So there's a visual, let's say there's a visual history in the archives that speaks to the sort of relationship between an authority, the public, and tenants in New York housing that plays out in the public spaces through ideas of maintenance. There was recently the story of, I forgot which NYCHA house it was, where they've got this new playground and the residents didn't want to leave, wanted to protect it and didn't want kids from outside of the property to play in it, right? So it's a really interesting kind of ground where different ideas of ownership play out really in the use and in the design. Anyway, so it really is a kind of was a kind of academic research project, like the kind of work that you do here at school, right? You dig into a topic, you go into the archives, you see what role design plays, what role the care for public space means in different contexts. And we turn that into a mural with Richard Chance as an illustrator we work with a lot, who brought all of the kind of timeline of maintenance as it plays out in this site into one large mural. So you see the uniformed guys, you see 1960s ideas of NYCHA wanting people to do tenant gardens, all the way to more recent forms of maintenance in this mural, and that was then exhibited in Berlin in this context, and Paris. And more recently, actually at the Patterson houses in the community center, where we designed this little piece of infrastructure around it, which also has these photos and has some photos from NYCHA residents as well. Anyway, long answer, just one quick example of the way we're thinking of exhibition also then. In this case, actually as a spatial intervention, right? So what is this? What is this exhibition also comes into a hopeful, useful piece of furniture at the NYCHA Community Center. But it's just also really fun to think about, again, to use maybe your skills as designers to think about how do you tell a story and how do you speak about historical research in ways that, or in graphics that are, pulling from other sources. And somebody who does a lot of the illustrations for music and portrait of Beyonce, and that's that sort of language, right? And to use those kind of that sort of visual language also really fun to do, right? And again, it's one of those areas where I think, as I said in the beginning, something that is important to us or that we talk about a lot, but I really think that also is very much what you as planning and design students, always the question, how do you take some of the world of ideas and research and academic work, how do you balance that with your more practical work? I don't want to say necessarily professional, but where you really engage with the material reality, plans or designs for how to build things, which is so exciting about our profession. And optimism, that's so exciting about planning and design, right? Where we have our feet in both worlds. Do all sorts of fun stuff with it. All right.
So on behalf of GSAP Urban Planning, I want to thank Tobias Armborst for giving the last talk of the LIP series this semester, and to thank each and one of you for attending and supporting the series this semester. We'll be having another lineup for the spring, so please stay tuned for our poster. And thank you and have a great day.